Untold Stories, the evolution of prison reform. Behind these walls lies a story rarely told, a story not just of punishment, but of survival, injustice, and change. From the medieval dungeons of Europe to the modern Supermax fortresses of America, prisons have shaped societies, and societies have reshaped prisons. But what few know is that the fight for reform has been as brutal, bloody, and relentless as the crimes that built these cages in the first place. Tonight, we peel back the layers of history. This is the untold story of how prison reform evolved, not as mercy, but as necessity. The birth of punishment. Before prisons, punishment was public. Thieves had their hands chopped off. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Crimes weren't contained behind walls. They were displayed on city streets as warnings carved into flesh. But by the 16th century, Europe faced a problem. Cities were growing, crimes were multiplying, and public executions were losing their sting. The answer was both simple and sinister. Lock people away, indefinitely. Prisons began as holding cells, places to keep people until execution or exile. But slowly, rulers discovered something else. Isolation could break a man's body just as surely as the noose. The birth of reform. By the 18th century, a radical idea spread through Europe. What if prisons weren't just cages, but classrooms for morality? Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued punishment should be proportional and reform possible. John Howard, a prison reformer in England, toured Europe's most infamous jails and was horrified. Disease, starvation, abuse. His reports shocked governments and planted the seed of change. From his work came the idea of penitentiaries, prisons designed not to torture but to inspire penitence, to make criminals reflect on their sins. The American experiment. In 1829, the world's first true penitentiary rose in Philadelphia, Eastern State. Towering walls, solitary cells, skylights meant to be the eye of God. Here, prisoners sat in silence, isolated 23 hours a day. Reformers believed solitude would cleanse the soul. But what reformers called redemption, others called torment. Solitary confinement drove many insane. Whispers of scratching walls, cries echoing through cell blocks. Eastern State became both a model and a warning. Meanwhile, New York pioneered the Auburn system. Silence, hard labor, uniforms. While Eastern State believed in isolation, Auburn believed in discipline. Both systems claimed to reform. Both created nightmares. The Industrial Revolution, the machinery of punishment. As the world industrialized, so did punishment. Prisons became machines, designed not only to contain but to produce. Inmates were put to work, sewing uniforms, breaking rocks, building roads. A new question emerged. Should prison labor be rehabilitation or exploitation? For many states, the answer was profit. The convict lease system exploded across the American South. Instead of building prisons, states leased prisoners, mostly African Americans arrested on petty or fabricated charges, to private companies. The Civil War had ended slavery on paper, but in reality the prison became the new plantation. Men were worked to death in mines, fields, and railroads. Reform was promised, but profit spoke louder. The age of progressivism. By the turn of the 20th century, the progressive era swept across America. Reformers saw prisons as broken and demanded science, psychology, and education replace whips and chains. The reformatory model was born. Places like Elmira Reformatory in New York promised rehabilitation through schooling, trade training, and parole. For the first time, prisoners were seen not just as criminals, but as men who could be remade. But this new vision was uneven. While some prisons offered education, others clung to brutality. Reform was an idea, but not yet a reality. Cracks in the walls. The Great Depression and Prohibition flooded prisons. Overcrowding, riots, corruption. America's prisons buckled under the strain. Famous gangsters like Al Capone made headlines, but inside cell blocks, ordinary men endured squalor and neglect. Calls for reform grew louder, but each decade revealed the same cycle: scandal, outrage, promises of change, followed by silence, the post-war boom, rising tensions. After World War II, America boomed, but so did its prison population. By the 1950s, the gap between the image of freedom outside and the reality inside grew impossible to ignore. Civil rights movements outside prison walls stirred anger inside. Black prisoners, long subjected to harsher sentences and conditions, began organizing. Their message was clear: prison reform wasn't charity, it was justice. And then, in the 1960s and 70s, reform collided with rebellion. The spark of Attica. September 1971, 4 days that shook America. We are men, we are not beasts. Attica Uprising, 1971. When inmates at Attica seized control of the prison, they weren't just rebelling against guards. They were rebelling against centuries of brutality, neglect, and broken promises of reform. For 4 days, the world watched. Inmates demanded reform, medical care, educate. Ion, religious freedom. But when the state retook the prison, 43 men lay dead, both prisoners and hostages. Attica became a turning point, a symbol of resistance, and a warning of how far America still had to go. After Attica, the nation reacts. After Attica, the nation could no longer ignore prison walls. Investigations revealed overcrowding, beatings, racial discrimination, and a system built more on revenge than rehabilitation. For a moment, reform seemed within reach. The 1970s saw reforms, educational programs, vocational training, legal protections for prisoners' rights. Courts began recognizing that inmates, though stripped of freedom, still retained their humanity. But this progress was fragile and short-lived. The war on drugs. The tide turned with 3 words: war on drugs. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in the 1980s, America declared war, not on crime itself, but on the communities where drugs spread. The battlefield, the prison system, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing. Small amounts of crack cocaine meant decades behind bars. Judges had no discretion. Rehabilitation was abandoned. Punishment became the only policy. From 1980 to 2000, the U.S. prison population exploded from 500,000 to over 2 million. America had 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. The birth of the Supermax. As prisons swelled, states turned to a new solution: lock away the most dangerous in places they could never escape. The Supermax prison was born. ADX Florence opened in 1994, became the blueprint. 23 hours a day in isolation, meals through slots, soundproof walls, no human contact. Officially, it was about safety. In reality, it was about control. Inmates called it a clean version of hell. The UN would later declare that prolonged solitary confinement was torture. But for America, it was the ultimate symbol of a system that had abandoned reform for containment. The human cost. By the 1990s, an entire generation was lost to mass incarceration. Communities fractured. Children grew up without fathers. Women, too, were imprisoned in record numbers, often for nonviolent drug offenses. Prisons became warehouses of the poor, the addicted, the mentally ill. And though politicians called it justice, others saw it for what it was: a human catastrophe. Voices of resistance. From the chaos, voices rose. Activists like Angela Davis warned that prisons had become a new form of slavery. Scholars exposed how laws targeted minorities. Former inmates testified about the horrors of solitary confinement and overcrowding. The debate over prison reform reignited. Was the goal punishment or rehabilitation? For decades, reformers fought against a system stacked against them, but cracks were forming. The 21st century shift. As the 21st century began, America faced two realities: endless wars abroad and a war at home with no end in sight. States were broke, prisons were overcrowded. Reform was no longer just moral, it was financial. California, facing court orders, began reducing its prison population. Other states experimented with drug courts, rehabilitation programs, and alternatives to incarceration. Slowly, the language of reform returned. At best, but the shadow of mass incarceration loomed. For every reform, thousands still sat in cells built for profit, not people. Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, the new spotlight. In 2014, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, sparked nationwide protests. The streets demanded justice, but behind bars, another truth was exposed. America's justice system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. The Black Lives Matter movement not only highlighted police brutality, it turned the nation's gaze toward mass incarceration. Questions once asked by academics and activists now flooded mainstream conversation. Why does America lock up more people than any other country? And who benefits from this system? The fight to close Rikers. Few prisons symbolize America's failures like Rikers Island. Corruption, violence, inhumane conditions. It became infamous worldwide. The story of Kalief Browder, a teenager held for 3 years without trial, much of it in solitary, exposed Rikers' cruelty to millions. Public outrage erupted. Activists, politicians, and everyday New Yorkers called for its closure. After years of pressure, the city announced a historic plan. Rikers would shut down, but reform is never simple. The plan faces delays, politics, and resistance from powerful unions. Bail reform, the cost of freedom. One of the most controversial reforms of the 2010s wasn't inside prison walls. It was in courtrooms. Bail reform. For decades, millions of Americans sat in jail, not because they were guilty, but because they were poor, unable to pay bail. They waited months, even years, for trials. Reformers demanded change. States like New Jersey and New York rolled back cash bail, arguing that freedom shouldn't depend on your wallet. Critics, however, warned of rising crime. Once again, reform collided with fear, the global comparison. As America struggled, the world offered stark contrasts. In Norway, prisons like Halden looked more like college campuses than fortresses. Inmates had private rooms, access to education, even recording studios. The philosophy: treat people like humans, and they'll leave as humans. In Germany, prisons emphasize dignity, rehabilitation, and preparation for reentry. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, mass incarceration policies created mega prisons packed with tens of thousands, scenes more dystopian than reformatory. The question was clear. If other nations could choose reform over revenge, why couldn't America? Technology, surveillance, the future of reform. As we enter the 2020s, reform faces a new challenge and a new opportunity. Technology, electronic monitoring, AI risk assessments, and virtual rehabilitation programs promise alternatives to traditional incarceration, but they also raise new fears: surveillance, bias, and control beyond prison walls. Will technology free us from mass incarceration or simply reinvent the cage? The pandemic's expose. When COVID-19 swept the globe, prisons became ground zero, overcrowded, unsanitary, impossible to socially distance. Inmates died by the thousands. Guards fell ill. Families begged for compassionate release. The pandemic revealed what reformers had warned us. Decades. Prisons are not just failing inmates, they're endangering society itself. Disease doesn't stay behind walls, neither does injustice.